Welcome everyone to today's news channel. Good afternoon, everyone. The storm unfolding in the Pacific Ocean is no longer just a matter of ground combat. It is already approaching the shore. The signals China is sending itself indicate that 17 years is a possible timeline for military action against Taiwan. The Beijing regime has abandoned the strategic secrecy it has maintained for years and has now begun to direct its military pressure toward its targets. The danger surrounding Taiwan is steadily approaching. The South Pacific is now literally like a forest of steel. More than 100 Chinese military vessels have reportedly been deployed to the region recently. This number far exceeds normal naval activity. It signifies a direct ground battle. The intentions of the Chinese Navy regarding Taiwan are gradually becoming clearer. In the air, the situation is becoming even more difficult. Between 20 and 40 Chinese fighter jets are intruding into Taiwan's airspace almost daily. Chinese Air Force bombers, stealth aircraft, and early warning systems are attempting to create an almost invisible ring around this island. However, this massive military position is by no means an easy target for Taiwan, which from the outside appears to be a powerless state, because what stands before Beijing is not just land. It is one of the world's most formidable natural fortresses, which has transformed its geography itself into a weapon of defense. To set foot on this island, one must contend not only with Chinese military weapons, but also with the ruthless reality of this geographical space. In other words, the Chinese military attack on Taiwan, which is predicted to occur around 2002 to 2017, is not as simple as some imagine. In fact, the Chinese government is well aware that sending its troops to Taiwan could result in enormous losses. Otherwise, the city would probably have already deployed all its military power to invade the island by now. Despite these risks clearly rising, the reasons why China has recently intensified its military activity in the region are even more noteworthy. Behind this sudden move by the Beijing regime lies a crucial diplomatic arsenal. It all began with that important summit between Donald Trump and China. The words Trump spoke at this summit considerably complicated the traditional diplomatic balance in the region. The American leader stated that arms sales to Taiwan were under consideration, indicating that Washington would either adopt a different strategy in its new era of combined Asian policy. This situation prompted China's top military presence in the region. Furthermore, the U.S. temporarily suspended a significant arms package planned for Taiwan worth $14 billion instead of the planned $1.40 billion. While the U.S. is responding to the Middle East crisis, Beijing may have seen this development as a late-stage window. Chinese strategists are praising this period when Washington's attention is focused to their advantage. Beijing will call it a strategy. In other words, they are simply trying to move while the judges are focused on the predictions. It is a familiar tactic, but it is hardly a sign of an impending earthquake. Precisely for this reason, China has decided to maximize its military presence in the Pacific. A massive air force centered around two combined aircraft carriers has passed through the Taiwan Strait and positioned itself in the South China Sea. They're accompanied by Type 05 missile destroyers, considered one of the most modern missile destroyers in the world, and Type 054A frigates. These aircraft form the core of a naval force capable of isolating Taiwan from the sea. In the air, J-20 stealth aircraft and H-6 strategic bombers are patrolling, attempting to cut off the island's breathing space. China has not yet fully crossed the line of no return. However, it is putting direct pressure on Taiwan's security nerves, and that pressure is increasing day by day. So will Taiwan wave its white hand of happiness in the face of this immense power 17 years from now, or even earlier? The answer is absolutely brain. Because for years, Taiwan has been preparing for such a worst-case scenario, weaving together a well-known non-prepared firefighting network known as the Mountain Storm Strategy. The primary objective of this strategy is not to leave China to a conventional all-out war. The real objective is to ensure that the cost of the Beijing regime's acquisition of this island will be extremely high, both politically and militarily. In fact, this is one of the strongest factors preventing China from moving toward Taiwan. If the Chinese military were to enter this island, it might face extremely heavy military losses. Because to reach Taiwan, the Chinese military would first have to cross the Taiwan Strait, one of the roughest and most dangerous waterways in the world. This is an invisible danger zone filled with Taiwan's 3 trillion sound-perceptible missiles. China's naval bases are at risk of becoming targets for these launching missiles and high-density grenades before they can even approach the Knights. The most important aspect of this problem comes from Taiwan's unforgiving terrain. For China, the most logical naval bases appear to be Tianyuan and Jingshui area on the island's west coast, because this is one of the most treacherous areas in the Taiwan Strait. However, the Taiwanese military is well aware of this fact and has transformed this location into an iron wall. The port of Commander, with its wide coastline, is protected by a massive bay and a plethora of launching missiles hidden along the shore. Let's say the Chinese military manages to land on this west coast, albeit at a heavy cost. Even in such a scenario, the real work only begins there. They immediately face the Qishan Sanriyong and Zhongzhong Sanriyong, both over 3,000 m high, stretching across the island. This mountainous region makes the advance of heavy-duty forces almost impossible and simultaneously provides the Taiwanese military with a perfect counterattack vantage point. Meanwhile, the Hualiantong region on the east coast, facing the Pacific Ocean, is an absolute nightmare for operation. Its coastline is extremely narrow, dropping sharply towards the mountains, leaving little physical space for a massive tactical force to move through. Furthermore, Taiwan hides its most important long-range missiles and fighter jets in vast underground areas along this east coast. As for the southern face, it is a candidate for a complete urban line nightmare. Even if the Chinese military were to occupy this port, they would have to live in densely populated urban areas, crammed into every street. So amid these preparations, have there been any tense moments in ground-based space? Well, there was a recent long-awaited moment between China and Taiwan illustrating this situation. A modernized F-16 V-16 fighter jet belonging to the Taiwanese Air Force tailed a Chinese J-16 fighter jet within Taiwan's airspace. This was no ordinary tracking. The Taiwanese pilot reportedly used the advanced infrared, advanced detection system of the aircraft's onboard sniper targeting pod to achieve a passive lock-on. The Chinese aircraft's radar was virtually unable to detect this lock-on. If this had turned into an actual combat situation, the Chinese pilot might have realized the danger only after it was too late. This incident demonstrates how crucial Taiwan's technological trump card is in balancing China's numerical superiority. However, Taiwan's trump cards are not limited to fighter jets and supersonic missiles. The Taiwanese government is directly applying the biggest lessons learned from the Ukraine war to its operations. Taiwan is developing a completely new and extremely dangerous unmanned doctrine called Hellscape. A dark swarm of low-cost, high-performance drones numbering only a few thousand is being prepared against massive Chinese warships costing hundreds of millions of dollars. The objective is to drag the Chinese Navy attempting to cross the strait into a swamp of steel filled with autonomous lines of warfare, both in the air and on the sea. These drones don't just fly. Human underwater drones, silently waiting just below the sea, are also part of this renowned network. These systems can always operate as swarms powered by artificial intelligence, without ever needing a traditional command center, and can choose vulnerable targets themselves. That is why direct land operations by China pose a huge risk to their own navy. In short, Beijing may be planning to bring an orchestra, but Taiwan has been preparing missiles to drown out that music for years. But China and Taiwan aren't the only ones on the chessboard. The real battle is happening a little further northeast on the map. Japan has already far exceeded the old pacifist defense stance it maintained after World War II. The Tokyo government is now facing reality squarely. Taiwan's downfall would mean that Japan's sea routes would be cut off, exposing Japan itself to an existential security threat. That is why Prime Minister Cao Yi and Japan's defense leadership have elevated the notion that a Taiwan crisis is a Japan crisis to official national policy. This is not panic. This is simply geography refusing to conform to political wishes, as it usually does. And unlike the comforting commentators who prefer slogans to maps, the Cao Yi administration is reading the map with both sides open. Japan is effectively turning an island that is only 110 kilometers from Taiwan into a veritable den of fire. Advanced radar systems, electronic warfare units, and medium-range aerial missiles are deployed on this island. Behind that, there is an even greater threat on Miyakojima and Ishigaki Island. Japan is deploying modernized medium-range missiles with a range exceeding 1,000 kilometers to these islands. This means the following, as the Chinese assessment puts it, in Taiping. Or, if they were to launch an attack on Taiwan from the east, they would have to pass through the dangerous range of Japanese missiles. Furthermore, Japan's actions do not stop there. The Tokyo government has just purchased 400 Tomahawk missiles from the United States and has begun integrating them into large Aegis zones. Japan is no longer a country that merely defends its own borders. It has become a country with the capability to retaliate and attack military bases and koans on mainland China if necessary. Naturally, Beijing is not pleased with this development. A preemptive regime is not happy at all to have its neighbor buy warning aircraft and very large pocket weapons. In the air, a new fleet of F-35 fighter jets continues to maintain a quiet patrol against the Chinese military over the South China Sea. 16 years later, approximately 55 to 60 F-35s, including A and B models, have been delivered to Japan. Tokyo's goal is to have a complete fleet of 147 aircraft in total by the 2030s. The 48th class of F-35As, currently serving the U.S. Air Force, were deployed to Misawa Air Base in March 2026. Misawa is located approximately 2,000 kilometers from mainland China. Thanks to its stealth capabilities, the F-35A can evade Chinese radar and quickly reach this region. To advance on Taiwan, China would need to move its forces from the northeast. However, the F-35s at Misawa have the capability to detect these Chinese movements early and launch preemptive strikes against necessary space and sea targets. These aircraft, in particular, could pose an invisible threat to China's combined aircraft carriers. Meanwhile, Japan can also deploy F-35Bs against China. The main base for these aircraft is Notobaru Air Base. This base is extremely important for a rapid response to the southern islands. Recently, the entire jet fleet has been operating quietly over the southern islands, evading Chinese radar. They remain vigilant. They monitor Chinese infections in aircraft, particularly in areas near the Miyako Strait and the Taiwan Strait, and can launch a preemptive strike if necessary. However, China is not the only nightmare in Japan's defense strategy. Tokyo faces the risk of simultaneous pressure from both the south and the north. In the north, there is intense tension with Russia due to the still unresolved Kuril Islands issue. Russia's Pacific Corps, based in the Pacific, though not as large in numbers as it once was, still poses a significant threat in the Sea of Japan, with its nuclear warfare capabilities. In particular, the increase in joint military exercises between China and Russia in the Pacific is forcing Japan to disperse its western base and build a 2000-line defense line. While Japan is strengthening its defenses in Hokkaido, it is also very carefully tracking Russian contingents passing through the Tsushima Strait. However, Japan is not the only one waking up in this equation. All countries in the Asia-Pacific are shifting to a similar state of alert. South Korea is raising its defense budget to record levels and integrating its military more directly with the American system. The Philippines has deployed near missiles to the Batanes Islands, a critical location for China's potential lawbreaking. Further south, Australia, under the umbrella of the AUKUS alliance, is accelerating its nuclear warship program and preparing to provide unwarranted cross-border bases to its political and legal allies in the Pacific. So where does America stand in this equation? While the Washington administration is showing a more cautious stance in the political dance by curbing arms sales, the military language on the ground tells a completely different story. Despite the pressure in the Middle East and Europe, the U.S. Navy is taking steps to renew its military deterrent in the Pacific. The USS George Washington has departed from Yokosuka, Japan, and begun a critical patrol mission in the Indo-Pacific waters. This ship is a more concrete and colossal example of American power in the region. Strategic bombers and submarines off Guam and newly deployed missile systems in the Philippines are ready to launch at any moment. A possible American plan might be to trap the Chinese Navy in a formidable net within the Pacific before it reaches Taiwan. However, what is being protected on this chessboard is not just land or a nation. This massive presence of the United States and its allies in the Pacific is actually an effort to protect the vital hubs of the global economy. Taiwan alone produces more than 60% of the world's most advanced reaction chips. In other words, it is the heart of today's technology. Even if China were to militarily release Taiwan and completely lock down the sea field, the global economy could become like a computer with the plug pulled. Production of everything from fighter jets to hospital life support devices, from the smartphone in your pocket to the automobile industry, could paralyze in an instant. This is one of the coldest realities behind Washington's efforts to keep this tension in the Pacific hot. Losing control of Taiwan would not simply mean a military defeat. It could mean the password to the digital age falling directly into Beijing's hands. However, there is a very real reality that Beijing is relying on. The world is currently in the midst of a level of global chaos unprecedented since World War II. The ongoing foreign war in Ukraine and the escalating crisis with Iran in the Middle East are severely straining the military resources of the United States and Europe. The world's aerial missile stockpiles are rapidly depleting, and attention is scattered. Chinese strategists calculate that the world cannot simultaneously face a third massive threat, especially in a geographical location like the Pacific. They believe that if China were to move against Taiwan, the most logical timing would be to act while American attention is diverted elsewhere. However, everything is proceeding on a very fine line. All these military buildups, missiles, warships, and stealth are raising regional tensions to such an extent that even a small spark could turn the Pacific into a fireball. As China moves towards its 2027 target, Beijing is well aware that time is actually working against them. As Japan completes its rearmament, Taiwan strengthens its non-symptomatic defense, and the United States shifts its attention back to the Pacific. Beijing's window of advance will rapidly close. That is why Xi is trying to exploit the current global crisis and the temporary political motives of its allies. And this is precisely where a high governor's stance becomes crucial. Tokyo's message is simple. Japan will not drowsily walk into danger just to make Beijing feel good. This may sound a little blunt, but blunt realism is still far better than Yugaji Zhaoyiman. In fact, what is truly frightening is that this Cold War has already begun. The Beijing regime is using invisible tactics known as the gray zone to shake Taiwan's nerves every second. Mysterious cuts of highly resistant fiber optic internet cables and daily large-scale cyber attacks on the island's critical infrastructure are shaping the silent front of this war. China is operating a vast network of false information to exert psychological pressure on the Taiwanese people and instill in them the idea that resistance is futile. Border judgments, covert economic sanctions, and diplomatic isolation to cut the island off from the world are being used as poison to corrode Taiwan from within. China knows very well that if the Taiwanese people's internal beliefs and will to resist are crushed, it may be able to swallow the island without using a single ship. What is happening now is not a traditional war. This may be one of the biggest, most tense, and most dangerous nerves history has ever seen. And whoever blinks first on this nerve will determine not only their own fate, but also a new geographical axis for the entire world. If China crosses that red line, the Pacific Ocean may face one of the most destructive aerial battles in human history. If Taiwan collapses, the US deployment in the Pacific will suffer a serious blow. Furthermore, such a scenario could trigger an existential security crisis for Japan and South Korea. However, if China makes this move and fails, a huge fault line may burst within the Beijing regime. It may all start with one misunderstanding, one wrong course, or one false miracle that shifted onto the radar. Now, 200216, the world sits on a giant bomb in its warm ocean, and it remains to be seen who will pull the pin. So what do you think about this issue? Do you think China will take advantage of the current global crisis to make a surprise move before Japan completes its military fundraising? Or is the Beijing regime always keeping in mind the possibility of decisive action by the actors in the Pacific and the United States in a potential extreme situation? That's all for today's broadcast. We look forward to receiving your valuable opinions.